Think your life is tough? Well, let's face it, you probably wouldn't last even one day back in medieval times. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what everyday medieval people dealt with would shock you. Let's start with food. The kind of meals that would send you sprinting back to the 21st century faster than you can say McDonald's. First things first, forget everything you've seen in movies. Those grand feasts with enormous turkey legs? Pure fantasy for most people. The reality was far more depressing and dangerous. For the average peasant, daily meals were about as thrilling as watching paint dry. Seriously, it was rough. Most peasants survived on something called pottage. Now, pottage was essentially a sad, watery stew. Picture your mom's mystery soup, except instead of secretly hiding vegetables, it often hid weevils and dirt. Yummy, right? Peasants cooked this mixture of random vegetables, whatever they could grow, in the same pot, often for days on end. Honestly, calling it soup might be too generous. Bread was another staple. But if you're imagining fluffy sliced bread from the supermarket, think again. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and full of unpleasant surprises. You see, the flour was ground using stone wheels. Stone wheels that would sometimes chip off, mixing rock fragments into the dough. Imagine biting into bread and crunching down on tiny stones. Medieval dentists probably didn't exist, but medieval toothaches definitely did. Speaking of bread, here's a horrifying tidbit. Many loaves contained ergot, a nasty fungus that grows on rye. Eating bread contaminated with ergot could lead to hallucinations, a burning sensation all over your body, and even death. Some historians even suggest that ergot poisoning contributed to witch hunt hysteria. Just imagine believing your neighbor was casting spells when really your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Talk about medieval hygiene disasters. Now let's discuss meat. Today you can buy fresh meat almost any time, but medieval folks? Not so lucky. Meat was a luxury, and when peasants finally got their hands on some, it was often borderline rotten. With no refrigerators, meat spoiled fast. To mask that lovely aroma of decay, they used heavy spices if they could afford them. Otherwise, they'd hold their noses and hope for the best. In medieval times, the 5-second rule was more like the 5-day rule. And here's another gut-wrenching fact. You couldn't even wash this disgusting meal down with water. Drinking water back then was like playing Russian roulette. It was usually contaminated with human waste and other nasty stuff. Instead, everyone drank beer or ale, even kids. We're not talking the strong craft beer you know today, but a weaker, watered-down version that was safer because the brewing process killed germs. On average, a medieval peasant drank about 8 pints of ale a day. Yep, children as young as 5 routinely drank beer at every meal. Medieval kids didn't need fake IDs for alcohol, they needed permission to drink water instead. Fish was another common medieval meal, but freshness wasn't exactly guaranteed. People living near the coast might enjoy fresh catches, but for those living inland, fish arrived days or even weeks old. Ever opened a refrigerator with week-old fish inside? Now multiply that stench by 10. No wonder spices were so popular. All this talk of rotten food and spoiled fish probably has your stomach turning, which brings us to the next medieval horror: going to the bathroom. For most people, answering nature's call meant using a chamber pot, a fancy term for a bowl or bucket kept conveniently under your bed. Once filled, you'd empty it yourself, usually right out the window onto the street below. Medieval street life wasn't just hazardous due to falling objects, it was hazardous due to falling feces. The common practice in towns was to shout, "Gardy Lou!" before tossing waste from upper windows. This charming warning comes from the French phrase garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. Of course, what they threw was anything but clean water. Some medieval cities even had rules stating waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 p.m., probably to avoid hitting important people walking by during daylight. If you ever had the luxury of visiting a castle, you might find something called a garderobe. See, it sounds fancy, right? Think again. It was basically a hole cut into a stone seat, dropping waste straight down the side of the castle wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered a garderobe dropping waste nearly 70 feet below. Sure, kings and queens sat on thrones, but their toilets? Just holes with an icy draft. And for those who couldn't hold it till they got home to their chamber pot, the options were grim. Public areas often had designated spots where people relieved themselves, essentially creating open sewers. London even had structures called common privies, built over rivers, but these were few and far between. Someone had to clean up this mess, and that unfortunate job fell to workers called gong farmers. Aikid gong farmers collected waste from cesspits and carried it outside city walls, working exclusively at night because the smell was so awful. In fact, the stench clung to them so strongly they weren't allowed in public gathering spots. On the upside, gong farmers were paid well, earning about 4 times more than a regular laborer. Money or not, though, imagine going home smelling like that every night. Medieval cities were legendary for their odor. London's River Thames was notoriously polluted, described as a monster of stink. And toilet paper, forget it. People used whatever was available. Leaves, moss, their left hand, or if wealthy, wool or hemp. Ancient Romans had used sponges on sticks soaked in vinegar or salt water, but medieval people conveniently forgot that hygienic trick. After a day spent drinking ale to avoid illness and desperately searching for a sanitary place to relieve yourself, you'd be more than ready to return to modern comfort. But the brutal bathroom situation was just one of many harsh realities medieval people faced daily. Forget romantic notions of being a knight or a fair maiden in a castle. Medieval life was grueling. Most people worked backbreaking jobs from sunrise to sunset, barely earning enough to survive. The majority were peasants farming land owned by nobles. A typical day meant waking at dawn, working until dusk, collapsing into bed, and repeating this cycle until death. Farmers plowed fields with wooden tools pulled by oxen, planted seeds by hand, and harvested crops with simple sickles. During harvest season, peasants worked 16-hour days, burning over 4,000 calories just from physical labor. Gym memberships? Unnecessary, just try surviving Tuesday. Next up, we'll dive deeper into the brutal jobs medieval folks had. And trust me, they make modern workdays look like vacations. For those who weren't farming, medieval life offered a variety of other grueling jobs, each with its own set of awful conditions. Blacksmiths spent their entire day working in smoky, scorching forges, breathing in toxic fumes, risking severe burns, and even blindness from flying sparks. Leather workers, or tanners, had it even worse. Their job involved turning animal hides into usable leather by soaking them in urine and other harsh chemicals. This nasty concoction stained their skin yellow and left them smelling terrible. Imagine trying to make friends when your scent literally cleared a room. Thinking about becoming a skilled tradesperson? You'd better start young. Apprenticeships typically began around age 7. That's right, 7-year-olds were sent away from their families to live and work with master craftsmen. These apprentices worked grueling schedules, 6 or even 7 days a week for up to 14 years. Only after enduring over a decade of demanding labor could they graduate to become journeymen and start earning a wage. Medieval career counselors didn't exactly have complicated job selection flowcharts. It was more like, can you lift heavy things? If yes, become a farmer. If no, good luck surviving childhood. Some jobs existed purely for the desperate and the poor. Take link boys, for example. Children whose sole job was carrying torches to guide wealthy people through dark streets at night. Or pure finders, who roam the streets collecting dog droppings to sell to leather tanners. Yeah, being paid to pick up dog poop. Talk about medieval entrepreneurship. And speaking of pay, medieval wages were often barely enough to survive. A typical day laborer in medieval England might earn only 1 or 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy 2 loaves of bread. There was no concept of a minimum wage, just a minimum amount needed so you wouldn't starve before finishing your day's work. With demanding physical labor and terrible nutrition, your body wouldn't hold up long. Disease was rampant, medicine was practically non existent, and healthcare methods resembled something straight out of a horror film. Medieval WebMD had one primary diagnosis for just about everything: you're probably going to die. Even common illnesses like a cold or flu today, easily treated with some rest and over the counter meds, could be a death sentence. Without any knowledge of germs or proper hygiene, medieval doctors believed sickness came from bad air or an imbalance in the body's 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And how do they rebalance these humors? By bloodletting, of course. Doctors would literally drain blood from your veins into a bowl, thinking this would cure just about anything. Imagine going in with a headache and coming out dizzy from blood loss. Another popular medical treatment was leeches' blood-sucking parasites placed on the skin to draw out bad blood. Why, ask why. One medical manual even recommended using up to 70 leeches at once for certain illnesses. It's safe to say medieval medicine had no concept of subtlety. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. Around 30% of children died before the age of 5, and the average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years. And let's not forget the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed roughly half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Imagine losing half the people you know within a few short years. Dental problems were particularly horrific. With no proper toothbrushes and zero understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay was widespread. Medieval dentistry wasn't about checkups or cleanings. Dentists simply waited for someone to start screaming loudly enough to warrant intervention. Even then, the solution was usually just pulling the offending tooth out. No painkillers included. When it came to medicine, the treatments themselves could be deadly. Mercury, a highly toxic element, was prescribed for everything from skin issues to sexually transmitted diseases. There were no warning labels about side effects because, quite honestly, the side effect was always, "This might kill you faster than the disease." To make matters worse, diseases spread easily due to medieval people's poor understanding of hygiene. Their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their palms on their already filthy clothing like trying to clean mud with more mud. If you survived these medical treatments, congratulations, but your troubles were far from over. Next up on the medieval nightmare tour, the justice system. Forget innocent until proven guilty. Medieval justice was cruel, random, and wildly unfair. Laws varied drastically from one town to the next. Something perfectly legal in your village could land you in a dungeon just 5 miles away. Most commoners had no clue what was illegal until they were accused of breaking the law. Medieval Miranda rights went something like this: you have the right to be punished. You have the right to beg for mercy. Good luck. Punishments rarely fit the crime. Even minor offenses like stealing food could result in having your hand chopped off. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes were punishable by death, including chopping down a tree in the king's forest or stealing anything worth more than 12 pennies. Trials were nothing like today's courts. Proving your innocence often meant enduring a trial by ordeal. One common method required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were declared innocent, an almost impossible outcome without modern medicine. Their version of a lie detector was essentially, let's see if God prevents you from suffering horrible pain. Another popular ordeal was trial by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank and risked drowning, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and promptly executed. There was literally no way to win. For those found guilty, executions were deliberately terrifying and public. Hanging was actually considered merciful compared to other punishments. Take drawing and quartering, reserved for serious crimes like treason. Victims were dragged by horses, hanged until almost dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, then finally chopped into four pieces. Public executions drew huge crowds who treated them like festivals, complete with food, drink, and entertainment. Medieval Netflix and chill? More like medieval hangings and snacks. And if you thought prisons provided some relief, think again. Medieval jails weren't long-term holding facilities. They were just temporary cells until punishment could be carried out. Prisoners were chained in dark, overcrowded dungeons with no state-provided food. Without family or friends bringing meals, prisoners simply starved. And torture? That was standard procedure not only as punishment, but to extract confessions. Devices like the rack, thumb screws, and iron maidens forced people to confess to anything, true or false, just to end their suffering, usually leading to execution anyway. Next, we'll uncover even more chilling truths about medieval justice, warfare, and everyday life. Trust me, you'll appreciate modern comforts more than ever. Imagine being accused of something you didn't do and facing torture until you confess only to be executed afterward. Medieval justice was less about fairness and more about terror. Public humiliation was a popular punishment for minor offenses. Take the stocks, for instance. You'd sit trapped with your head and hands locked between wooden boards in the town square, as villagers threw rotten fruit, mud, or worse at you. There was also the ducking stool, used mainly on women accused of gossiping or arguing too loudly with their husbands. Victims were strapped to chairs and repeatedly dunked underwater, sometimes to the brink of drowning. Medieval couples therapy was apparently pretty extreme. Law enforcement back then wasn't exactly professional either. Towns hired night watchmen, typically older men too weak for heavy labor, whose job was mainly to shout if they spotted a crime or fire. Medieval police didn't read you your rights. They yelled, "Stop, thief!" and hoped someone nearby would trip you. Being accused of a crime, even falsely, could completely ruin your life. Forget innocent until proven guilty. Medieval courts assumed you were guilty and put the burden entirely on you to prove otherwise, usually through painful ordeals. If medieval justice wasn't frightening enough, warfare was even worse. Movies portray medieval battles as heroic scenes with knights in gleaming armor charging across fields. In reality, medieval warfare was chaotic, brutal, and almost always deadly, especially for ordinary people. Wars were constant. During the Hundred Years' War between England and France, fighting dragged on from 1337 to 1453. That's actually 116 years, not 100, of endless conflict. Most medieval people experienced war repeatedly throughout their short lives. Unlike today, when many people live entire lives without directly experiencing warfare, medieval folks dealt with it regularly. Armor might seem protective, but only the wealthiest knights could afford full suits of plate armor, which cost roughly as much as a modern luxury sports car. For most soldiers, armor was simply thick, padded cloth garments called gamisons, sometimes with a few metal plates sewn on if they were lucky. Those iconic knights in shining armor? They were basically the medieval equivalent of flashy sports car owners, rare, wealthy, and probably showing off. Weapons weren't much better. Swords were expensive, usually reserved for knights and nobles. Common soldiers relied on spears, axes, or farm tools modified for battle. The most feared weapon wasn't the sword, it was the English longbow. Bowmen trained from childhood to use bows with draw weights up to 200 pounds, which literally deformed their skeletons over time. These bows could penetrate armor at close range, making knights vulnerable to even humble archers. Medieval battles were astonishingly lethal. Take the Battle of Towton in 1461, where roughly 28,000 soldiers died in a single day. That was about 1% of England's entire male population at the time. Many soldiers never even reached the battlefield. dying from harsh weather conditions like freezing snowstorms before combat even began. Even minor battle wounds were frequently fatal because infections were inevitable. With no antibiotics or antiseptics, any injury could quickly turn deadly. Medical care on the battlefield essentially consisted of two treatments: rub dirt on it for minor wounds and say your prayers for everything else. But for peasants, the worst part of war wasn't even the fighting, it was the armies themselves. Soldiers didn't carry their own supplies, they lived off whatever they could steal from nearby towns and villages. Armies commonly burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and destroyed homes, leaving villagers to starve. Medieval soldiers' motto might as well have been, support our troops by handing over your food, and hope we leave your house standing. Sieges were especially horrifying. When an army surrounded a castle or walled city, those trapped inside faced slow, agonizing starvation. During the Siege of Paris from 885 to 886, residents became so desperate they resorted to eating rats, cats, and even each other. Some sieges lasted for months or years. The longest siege on record was at Candia, or modern Heraklion, lasting an unbelievable 21 years. Imagine being trapped inside the city for 2 decades, knowing that stepping outside meant certain death. Disease killed far more soldiers than actual combat. Armies created ideal conditions for illness. Thousands of men packed together with poor sanitation, limited food, and contaminated water. During the Crusades, European armies often lost half their soldiers to disease before they even reached their destination. Civilians caught in war zones faced impossible choices. Fleeing meant abandoning homes and possessions, risking starvation or attack on the road. Staying meant enduring violence and looting by passing armies. Medieval chronicles describe entire villages being slaughtered, men, women, and children alike. War spared no one. If by some miracle you avoided being drafted into these conflicts, survived roaming armies, and didn't starve, you still had the general misery of everyday medieval life to endure. The first thing you'd notice stepping into a medieval town wasn't the charming architecture, it was the smell. Medieval streets reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, tanning chemicals, butchered animals, and smoke from countless fires. Without garbage collection, trash piled up everywhere or was dumped straight into rivers. Butchers discarded animal guts and blood directly onto the street, turning sidewalks into slippery horror scenes. People carried small pouches filled with herbs called pomanders to hold beneath their noses, hoping to mask the overwhelming stench. Medieval air fresheners were basically just slightly less awful smelling stuff to distract you from the truly awful smelling stuff. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. People bathed maybe a few times a year, usually at the start of spring and the end of summer. Some believed that bathing opened the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. During winter, it wasn't unusual to go 4 or 5 months without washing. Head lice were so common that special lice combs were standard grooming tools. Medieval dating profiles probably listed only moderately lice-infested as an attractive feature. Clothing wasn't much better. Most people owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes total, wearing them until they literally fell apart. Underwear was scratchy linen that irritated the skin, while outer garments were thick wool that constantly itched. Shoes were thin pieces of leather with flat soles that offered almost no protection from the elements. Language itself would also be a barrier. Middle English from the 1400s sounded almost completely foreign to modern ears. Even basic phrases like "Wyatt is thin, Nama," "What is your name?" would be practically unintelligible. You'd struggle to communicate, and everyone around you would think you were speaking gibberish. And forget privacy. Most medieval families lived in single-room homes where everyone ate, slept, and worked together. Beds were shared by multiple family members, and travelers staying at inns frequently shared beds with complete strangers. Even the wealthy had servants present at all times, including during their most private moments. Next, we'll dive even deeper into medieval daily life. The limited entertainment, rigid social hierarchy, rampant superstition, and painfully slow communication. Trust me, you're definitely going to appreciate your comfy modern life more than ever. Think you'd find ways to entertain yourself in medieval times? Well, good luck with that. Entertainment options back then were incredibly limited and often disturbingly violent. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were social events. Entire towns gathered to watch hangings or beheadings as if they were festivals, complete with food, drinks, and cheerful crowds. The medieval equivalent of Netflix binge watching was essentially watching your neighbor get executed. But executions weren't the only violent form of amusement. Animal baiting was another popular pastime, where crowds watched chained bears or bulls fight packs of aggressive dogs. People cheered as these animals tore each other apart. Compared to that, your average MMA fight looks downright tame. Less violent entertainment did exist, but it was rare. Occasionally, traveling performers or musicians would pass through, offering a brief break from daily monotony. Storytellers or minstrels might visit villages to share tales of heroes, legends, and adventure, but these treats didn't come around often enough to break the constant tedium of everyday life. Social life itself was brutally restricted by the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy that defined your entire existence. Roughly 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing. They farmed land owned by nobles, paid steep taxes, and had virtually no rights. Changing your station in life, going from peasant to noble, or even moving into a different profession, was nearly impossible. Your social position was fixed at birth, and medieval society wasn't exactly known for upward mobility. If you think ignorance is bliss, then medieval times might sound appealing. Knowledge was severely limited, and superstition filled the gaps. Most people believed deeply in witches, demons, magical creatures, and evil spirits causing disease. Illnesses weren't explained by bacteria or viruses, but by curses, imbalanced humors, or bad air. So, even natural phenomena like solar eclipses were terrifying events, causing entire villages to panic, convinced the world was ending. And fact-checking? Forget about it. Medieval fact-checking amounted to asking the oldest person in town if they'd ever heard anything similar. If they hadn't, it must be true or witchcraft. With education reserved primarily for the wealthy or clergy, the average medieval peasant's understanding of the world was limited to their immediate surroundings. Most had no clue what existed beyond their village boundaries. Communication was another serious challenge. Information traveled at the pace of a walking messenger or horseback rider, painfully slow and unreliable. News from just 50 miles away could take days or even weeks to arrive. Messages from distant countries might take months if they arrived at all. Forget staying up to date with current events. Most medieval folks barely knew what was happening in the next village. Even basic survival was a constant struggle. Homes offered minimal protection from the elements. Most were small, drafty structures with dirt floors, leaking roofs, and little insulation. During winter, families huddled together around a single fireplace wrapped in blankets, shivering through freezing nights. Summers brought heat and humidity without any modern relief like fans or air conditioning. Food shortages were common, especially during harsh winters or failed harvests. Peasants frequently faced starvation, surviving on scraps and whatever edible weeds they could forage. During famines, entire villages might resort to eating bark, grass, or even boiled leather just to fill their stomachs. Hunger wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a very real threat to survival. Water scarcity could also devastate entire communities. Since most water sources were polluted with human and animal waste, finding clean drinking water was a constant challenge. Droughts weren't merely inconvenient, they could wipe out entire villages by destroying crops and making livestock impossible to sustain. Let's talk clothing again because medieval attire deserves its own moment of horror. People typically wore the same garments for weeks or months without washing them. Washing clothes required immense effort, involving hours of scrubbing by hand with harsh soap. Not surprisingly, most avoided doing laundry whenever possible. As clothes became worn out or torn, peasants simply patched them repeatedly. By the time clothing was discarded, it was often reduced to little more than tattered rags. Shoes weren't much better. Made from thin, untreated leather, medieval footwear offered almost no protection from harsh weather or rocky terrain. Many peasants simply went barefoot during warmer months, exposing themselves to cuts, infections, and other injuries. Imagine spending an entire day working fields barefoot with sharp stones, thorny weeds, and animal droppings everywhere. Transportation was another major inconvenience. With no cars, bicycles, or public transit, most travel occurred on foot. Even short journeys between towns or villages took hours or days. Roads, if you could even call them that, were muddy, rocky paths often impassable during heavy rains or snowstorms. Horse-drawn carts existed, but few peasants could afford them. Long-distance travel was dangerous, expensive, and incredibly slow. Medieval inns, or alehouses, were typically dirty, overcrowded, and offered minimal comfort. Travelers often shared beds with complete strangers' beds infested with lice, fleas, and other pests. Staying overnight meant risking robbery, assault, or simply getting sick from the filthy conditions. The medieval hotel industry definitely didn't earn any five-star reviews. Privacy was essentially non-existent in medieval life. Families lived crammed together in one-room houses, performing all daily activities, cooking, eating, sleeping, in the same small space. Wealthy homes might have separate rooms, but servants were present constantly, offering zero real privacy. Imagine never having a moment truly alone ever. Childhood was short and harsh. Children as young as 5 or 6 helped with farm work, household chores, and childcare. They were expected to behave as miniature adults, disciplined severely for even minor infractions. Education was reserved for the wealthy or clergy, leaving most children illiterate and uneducated, destined for a life of manual labor just like their parents. Medieval marriage wasn't romantic either. It was purely practical, arranged for social or financial benefit. Girls often married as teenagers, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Spouses rarely married for love, and women had few legal rights, essentially becoming the property of their husbands. Divorce was practically non-existent, meaning unhappy couples were stuck together for life, no matter how miserable they might be. Despite these harsh realities, people managed to endure. But life expectancy was shockingly low, with most medieval adults living only into their 30s or early 40s. Infant and child mortality were extraordinarily high, with nearly a third of all children dying before reaching adulthood. Simply surviving to adulthood was considered an achievement. Medieval life was anything but romantic. It was an endless cycle of hard labor, brutal conditions, violence, disease, and oppression. If you think you'd enjoy traveling back in time, think again. Modern life, with all its stresses, offers comforts and protections that medieval folks couldn't even dream about. Next, in our final part, we'll wrap things up by looking back at all the reasons you wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. And trust me, after this journey, you'll be glad you don't have to. So after everything we've covered, the rotten food, the bloodletting doctors, the justice system that made zero sense, you're probably thinking, yeah, I'm good here in the 21st century. And honestly, same. Let's rewind and remember what medieval life really looked like. Your average day started before sunrise. No alarm clocks, just a rooster if you were lucky, or a bell rung by a monastery down the road. You'd wake up sore from yesterday's labor, sleep deprived from a flea-infested straw mattress, and hungry. Always hungry. Breakfast? Probably some stale, rock-hard bread filled with groundstone, and maybe a sliver of cheese if you had a good week. And if your bread wasn't giving you a dental emergency, there was always the chance it was laced with ergot fungus, ready to launch you into a hallucinatory nightmare. After choking that down with your breakfast ale because water could kill you, you'd head off to work. Whether you were a farmer, a tanner, a blacksmith, or a child apprentice scrubbing a floor, your day would be one long stretch of physical labor in harsh conditions with minimal tools, all while inhaling smoke, waste, and body odor from yourself and everyone around you. If you were a woman, things didn't get much easier. Most women were either laborers or housewives managing huge workloads, cooking over open fires, hauling water from a well, grinding flour, raising children, and making clothes without washing machines, stoves, or running water. Women had little to no autonomy, couldn't own property in many places, and were subject to their husband's will. And if you dared to speak your mind, you might find yourself strapped into a ducking stool and dunked in a river for being a scold. Social mobility? Practically non-existent. Born a peasant, die a peasant. The idea of following your passion or doing what you love didn't exist. You did what you were told or you starved. Period. If you showed too much curiosity or refused to follow the rules, you might end up being accused of witchcraft or heresy, both of which could land you on the business end of a torch. And let's not forget the constant backdrop of war. Whether your lord was battling his neighbor, your country was being invaded, or the king was off on a crusade, someone was always fighting. And when soldiers passed through your village, they didn't pay for supplies, they took them. They didn't protect you, they pillaged and moved on. Civilians were just collateral damage. Hoping for a moment of peace or prayer? Religion was everywhere, and the church held more power than kings in many parts of Europe. But while priests preached piety, they also enforced terrifying ideas. Everything was a sin. Illness, punishment from God. Bad weather? Probably your neighbor's fault for harboring impure thoughts. And don't even get started on the Inquisition. As for education, good luck. Unless you were rich, male, and destined for the clergy, you likely never learned to read or write. Books were so rare and expensive that most people lived and died without ever touching one. Your knowledge came from oral tradition, superstition, and rumors. Forget Wikipedia. Your best source of information was the village gossip who might or might not have confused a comet with a dragon. And let's take a moment to talk about health. What little of it existed. Got a fever? That's probably bad air or too much blood. Time to drain it out. Got a toothache? Someone will yank that out with a pair of pliers they just wiped on their pants. Maybe got the plague? You'll be dead in 3 days, and no one will bury you because they're afraid of catching it too. Even childbirth, something that should be beautiful, was one of the most dangerous things a woman could go through. There were no hospitals, no painkillers, no sterile instruments. Women often gave birth at home surrounded by other women, hoping the midwife knew what she was doing. Many didn't survive. Even if the mother lived, infants had a 1 in 3 chance of dying before the age of 5. Let's say you somehow made it to adulthood. Congrats. That meant 16-hour workdays, unwashed clothes, and a life expectancy that barely made it past your 30s. Your teeth would be rotting, your back would be destroyed, and your diet would have given you scurvy 3 times over. And if you committed a crime or were merely accused, justice was a coin toss. Carry a hot iron and hope God heals your hand. If not, well, you clearly weren't innocent. Nighttime didn't bring much relief either. No electricity meant pitch-black streets. Torches were dangerous and expensive. Most people stayed indoors after sunset. Not for rest, but out of fear. Criminals, animals, or just bad luck could all strike after dark. If your home caught fire, good luck putting it out. There were no fire brigades. Fires often spread uncontrollably, destroying whole villages. So why does the medieval world still feel so romanticized in books, movies, and fantasy series? Probably because we edit out the horror and leave in the castle's chivalry and sword fights. But behind every noble knight was a mountain of mud, disease, suffering, and injustice. Behind every castle banquet was a servant scrubbing out a garderobe chute filled with 2 years' worth of royal waste. Truth is, the past is fascinating, but it's not where you want to live. It's a time best visited from the comfort of your heated home, clean clothes, and a stomach full of actual food. You can admire the architecture, marvel at the art, and learn from the history, but let's not pretend we'd thrive there. So the next time your Wi Fi cuts out or your coffee order's wrong, just remember at least you're not being dunked in a freezing river for gossiping or eating worm filled pottage for dinner. You survived the deep dive into medieval life. Congratulations, you've made it to the end. Now go take a hot shower, drink some clean water, and enjoy a snack that didn't come from a 400-year-old bucket under someone's bed. Because let's face it, you wouldn't last a single day in medieval times.